I'm Warren Hoge, IPI Senior Adviser for External Relations, and I'm happy to welcome you to this Speaker Series event featuring Ivan Šimonović, United Nations Assistant Secretary General for Human Rights. He will be discussing a report being released today by the UN High Commissioner of Human Rights, a report of the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine, and we will have a question and answer period following his presentation. You have his full biography in your papers, so let me just say briefly that he has been Assistant Secretary General for Human Rights since July of 2010, heading up UNHCR's office in New York. Among his previous positions are Minister of Justice and Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs of Croatia, and his country's permanent representative to the United Nations. I am also pleased to note that he has been a frequent visitor to IPI and participant in past IPI public meetings. I will also be brief in introducing the situation in Ukraine that will be the focus of our discussion today, since it is sadly so current, so ongoing, and so impactful. As you know, for more than 2 months, the Ukrainian military has been battling pro-Russian rebels in the eastern regions of Donetsk and Luhansk, with hundreds of casualties, rising crime and displacement of civilians, and multiple instances of human rights abuses affecting both the local population and the combatants. Just today, there is word from Kiev that the new president of Ukraine, Petro Poroshenko, has proposed a unilateral ceasefire by government forces as part of a 14-point peace plan to end the separatist violence in the eastern part of the country, and that he has discussed it on the phone with Russian President Vladimir Putin. Assistant Secretary General Šimonović has visited Ukraine 3 times since March, and this 58-page report is the 3rd monthly report of the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission. As you can see, Ivan, there is enormous interest in its findings, so please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, let me begin by thanking IPI for hosting this event and for the opportunity to discuss findings of the 3rd United Nations Human Rights Monitors in Ukraine. During my last mission to Ukraine in May, I have talked to an elderly lady in Donetsk, and when she was describing the situation in the east of the country, she said that it is a fight in which everyone loses. And this is exactly what this current monthly report describes. The number of casualties on both sides is increasing and has reached over 400 since mid-April. We have received recently first reports of children being killed. On 9th June in Slovyansk, a boy of 12 and a girl of 6. The number of unlawful detentions is also increasing. Prices of basic commodities are rising while salaries decrease. Social services, and in particular in areas where fighting is going on, are increasingly being disrupted. Before outlining some of the highlights of the 3rd monthly report, allow me to provide you with some background on the United Nations monitoring mission in Ukraine. The mission has been established in mid-March 2014. It was fully operational just within 2 weeks after its establishment. It currently comprises 34 staff members, including both national and international staff. In addition to headquarters based in Kiev, it has sub-regional offices in Lviv, Kharkiv, Odessa, and Donetsk. The monitors also monitor the situation in Crimea in a manner consistent with the General Assembly Resolution 68/262 of 27 March 2014 on the territorial integrity of Ukraine. Initially, the mission was deployed for 3 months, but we have recently received a letter from the government of Ukraine requesting extension of our mandate for another period of 3 months, lasting until mid-September. We have enjoyed very good cooperation with both government and civil society, as well as other international presences in Ukraine, and especially OSCE. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to draw your attention to some of the opportunities and challenges identified in this report, and then move to some suggestions for the way forward. The election of the new president and the announcement of parliamentary elections before the end of the year represent an opportunity for a fresh start without corruption, without impunity, in Ukraine that is embracing its rich diversity and is inclusive all of its minorities. During the presidential elections, we witnessed relatively few human rights violations in most of the country. However, serious concerns have been raised by our monitors regarding violations in eastern regions of Donetsk and Luhansk, where there were numerous attacks on elections commissions and commissioners ahead of elections as well as during the elections. In spite of it, the turnout during the elections was quite high, and President Poroshenko's challenge now is not one of legitimacy, but more of winning the confidence of population in the east of the country and the challenge of reconciliation. In this context, the ongoing National Roundtable on constitutional amendments proposing protection of minority rights and the decentralization of power are crucial. Following the Geneva statement on 17th April, roundtables on national unity, co-organized by the government of Ukraine and OSCE, were held on 14, 17, and 21st of May. In fact, formally they were not co-chaired by Ukrainian government and OSCE, but they had their facilitators as independent persons. Parliament's adoption of the 20th May of a resolution entitled Memorandum of Concord and Peace reflected many issues that were discussed during those roundtables. It foresees the adoption of constitutional reform package that would include decentralization of power and special status for the Russian language, judicial and police reform, and the adoption on an amnesty law for anti-government protesters in the East who would accept giving up their weapons, except of those who were involved in some serious crimes against life and physical integrity. This is all a welcome development. A number of key legislative projects are on the way or have already been completed, and they represent another opportunity for Ukraine to turn the page on its turbulent past by putting in place some important safeguards. These are aimed at ensuring minorities are represented in governance, at fighting corruption and combating torture and impunity. On 13 May, for example, Parliament adopted a law that provides for more stringent penalties for corruption offences committed by individuals and legal entities. This will be key to addressing the root causes of the Ukrainian crisis. Another draft law now before Parliament is dealing with the official status of the Russian language in Ukraine. And it is also an opportunity to rectify an earlier attempt of the Parliament back in March to make Ukrainian the sole official language of Ukraine. The new draft law proposes to give official status to the Russian language without compromising the position of Ukrainian as the state language. These are some major opportunities that report highlights. Now, let me turn to the challenges. The situation in eastern Ukraine represents the most pressing challenge to the country at this moment. Our latest report outlines in great detail the deteriorating human rights situation in this part of the country and highlights the impact of the fighting on people's enjoyment of their economic and social rights as well as civil and political rights. While casualty figures remain difficult to verify, especially in the areas where there is an ongoing fighting, as of 11 June, the government cites 210 casualties in the east since the 14th of April. However, our monitors have been able to record 404 killings since mid-April. A climate of lawlessness prevails in the east with an increase in criminality. Killings, abductions, and detentions by the armed groups continue, and this report indicates clearly that these human rights abuses are not any longer affecting just people involved in politics or journalists, but they are being perpetrated against the population indiscriminately. According to the government, from April to 7th of June, armed groups in the eastern region abducted 387 people, among them 39 journalists. Our monitors are keeping track of reports on abductions and are trying to verify the reports through direct contacts with the families, victims, and we were able to confirm 222 cases of abductions and detention by armed groups. Of these, 4 persons have been killed, 137 have been released, and 81 remain detained as of 7 June. Freedom of expression is under threat in Ukraine, particularly in the eastern regions. Since the beginning of the crisis, Ukraine has become one of the most dangerous places in the world for journalists. On a daily basis, journalists face the threat of abduction and illegal detention as well. Yesterday, 2 Russian journalists were killed by mortar fire. This follows the killing of an Italian photojournalist and his Russian interpreter on 24th of May. So altogether in the east we had 4 journalists killed, and during Maidan protests another journalist, so altogether 5 journalists. Abductions of journalists have been increasing at a worrying rate, and it seems to continue in the recent weeks. The number of people carrying arms in the region of Donetsk and Luhansk has also increased, and representatives of the self-proclaimed Donetsk People's Republic have, for the first time, acknowledged that among their fighters there are some volunteers coming from Russian Federation, most of them coming from Chechnya or being Cossacks. This, of course, shows a clear danger of a possible spillover of the current crisis in eastern Ukraine. And in the same time, in the context of government's security operations, there has been an increase in reports on enforced disappearances and excessive use of force that have led to casualties among civilians, which we continue to investigate. The fighting has had a very serious impact on enjoyment of economic and social rights of those residing in the east. The report indicates that 21,700 students have not been able to attend schools in Slovyansk region since May. Hospitals continue to be overcrowded and understaffed. Medical supplies are low, and it is reported by the Ministry of Health that up to 10 medical facilities have been closed in eastern regions. Food prices have skyrocketed, and season vegetables the price of seasoned vegetable in overall Ukraine has increased by 30%. But in eastern part of the country, it has now an average of 4 to 5 times more than before. Meanwhile, it is becoming increasingly difficult for business to operate and for people to work. There have been, for instance, armed attacks against some mining companies, which constitute the main share of the region's economy. Deteriorating situation in the east has had a negative effect on the rise of IDP population, leaving especially from Donetsk and Luhansk regions. The number has almost doubled in 1 week. Estimates put over 15,000 IDPs to be from the regions of Donetsk and Luhansk. In the absence of a formal registration system and given the limited access in some areas, the number of IDPs is likely to be higher than the numbers that we are reporting. About half of the population of Donetsk region experience some problem with access to the water. The situation is worst in Slovyansk. There is no running water, and residents just simply have to resort to using wells. Around 40% or around 90% of the town is without electricity, and phones do not work most of the time, and there is almost no public transportation. The government's announcement that it will create transit corridors to allow civilian population to escape fighting must be regarded with caution, and the UN has not been requested to play a role in it. If civilians feel the need to leave conflict areas, this should be facilitated, and the government's announcement of corridors has a positive impact. However, measures should also be taken to provide an alternative to displacement whenever possible, including assistance in the place for those who decide to stay. Now, moving to the situation in the East, from situation East to yet another challenge, let me address the issue of accountability. Progress towards accountability for the human rights violations committed during Maidan protests remains very slow. According to NGO SOS Maidan, a total of 113 persons were killed during Maidan violence from November 2013 to February 2014, of which 109 in Kiev and 4 in the other regions. However, to this date, there have yet to be any completed prosecutions for identified perpetrators. Some arrests have been made of Berkut forces, but it will be important that there is no victor's justice, and that also those who have been involved in killing of 40 police and security forces must be held accountable as well. The 2nd of May tragedy in Odessa, during which 42 persons lost their lives in the trade union building, and other 6 in events preceding that, also remains of utmost concern. The UN monitors reported extensively on the ongoing investigations into this tragic event, which points towards grave inaction on the part of police and fire brigade in taking necessary measures to prevent incidents. One aspect that both accountability processes for Maidan and Odessa have in common are that they are both subject to a proliferation of investigations. 5 on Maidan and 6 on Odessa. This presents a risk of miscommunication between law enforcement agencies and possible contamination of evidence. It is highly important that progress is speedily achieved with this investigation, as there is high interest for its results and there is a pressure on victims' behalf. There is also a need for greater transparency in the investigations, as this could help ease some tensions among the population. Now let me briefly turn to the situation in Crimea as yet another challenge. What we are facing in Crimea is a sort of a legal limbo. Although Ukrainian legislation is supposed to remain in force until 1st January 2015, legal institutions and framework are already required to comply with the provisions of legislation of the Russian Federation. This has some very practical and very unfortunate consequences, as some 15,000 judicial cases remain in limbo between Ukrainian and Russian laws and legal systems. The Crimean Tatar population have already been facing some limitations on their enjoyment of freedom of expression, peaceful assembly, association, and religion. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, before concluding my presentation, I will just say a few words on the way forward. It is crucial that we seek opportunities to build confidence with the divided population in eastern Ukraine. President Poroshenko's peace plan, as announced during his inauguration, may provide a basis for building confidence. However, in parallel, there needs to be constitutional, inclusive, and meaningful consultations with all political parties, regardless of their ideology, as well as with representatives of civil society and minority communities. All this has to be accomplished speedily, as the armed groups, they were able to take power. However, they are incapable to govern the area. Sooner or later, social services will collapse. There will be disruption of social services with extremely negative consequences for population, including possible displacement. There is also a growing need to address the situation of abductions and detentions. During my last visit, I discussed the possibility of instituting human rights and humanitarian-based confidence-building measures. The human rights monitors have been involved in efforts to negotiate the release of individuals detained by the armed groups under control of a so-called Donetsk People's Republic and Luhansk People's Republic, and following repeated interventions, we had some success in releasing, but we also had some success in releases of some people who were held in custody of government forces. I have visited some of those detainees when I was in Ukraine myself. The Human Rights Monitor mission in Ukraine can potentially play a constructive role because it has contacts with both sides. At some point, we may even envisage an all-for-all prisoners release within the framework of international law. It's good in itself because we are releasing people who are suffering from detention, but it would also help to start political dialogue on other issues as well. With regard to the future of monitoring mission, as we move in fourth month of our operation, it will be important that in parallel to monitoring and reporting, the mission also gets involved into increased technical assistance to the government of Ukraine in implementation of the recommendations contained in previous 3 reports. As a start, we need to assess the level of implementation of those recommendations and look at the gaps and opportunities when we can work together with government to address human rights concerns. Ladies and gentlemen, among the root causes of instability in Ukraine, of protests, of Maidan, were corruption, human rights violations, impunity, and the lack of accountability. Measures to address the current crisis, therefore, have to also address these systemic concerns. With the election of President Poroshenko and the envisaged parliamentary elections before the end of the year, there is an opportunity for the government of Ukraine to prioritize institutional reform, focusing on human rights challenges in the short term, while paving the way for the establishment of a system that promotes and protects human rights for all, ensures justice, good governance and rule of law through inclusive, non-discriminatory and participatory system. We stand ready to support the government on its path to overcome current challenges. Thank you.
Ivan, come and have a seat. I'm going to ask you 2 or 3 questions, then we're going to go to the floor, where I'm sure there'll be many questions and much comment. You mentioned, I want to ask you about the role of the 34 monitors you have, the UN, and basically how the UN is functioning in that area. I take it you mentioned that you had not been asked to assist with the transit corridors. Is the UN discouraged from finding information? There's a lot of specific information in this report. So obviously the monitors were able to find out quite a bit. But how difficult is it for them, and how discouraged are they by both sides from doing their work?
Concerning corridors, and they are called by government escape corridors and not humanitarian corridors, we have lukewarm feelings. On one side, you are quite right. We are concerned by increasing number of civilians getting hurt in the area of fighting. On the other hand, by encouraging their departure, you may not be doing the right thing. So we think that there should be a balance between helping people who are in danger to leave and in the same time providing various forms of assistance to people in situ, where they are, without making them leave by making their life more difficult.
In the report, when it talks about IDPs, the report says the largest number of them are coming from Crimea. Why are so many people leaving Crimea, and what reason do they cite for their departure?
At the moment, situation is changing. Now, majority of displacement is from the east of country. Okay. And it's now over 15,000 who have been displaced from eastern part of the country. Previously, we were having a situation initially of displacement from Crimea, and it was immediately after integration of Crimea into Russian Federation, where simply some people preferred to move to other parts of Ukraine, some of them also being Crimean Tatars. I would say that now we could roughly estimate the number of displaced to about 35,000. However, we can't be completely sure because some people are moving, they stay with their families, they are not registered. So this is just an assessment. Number may be higher.
And then finally, I wanted to ask you about the journalists. You talked about the rather high number of journalists who had been killed, abducted, arrested, detained. And something that the report discusses that you did mention was the role of hate speech in this struggle. Could you talk a bit about that? And actually the role, obviously, people who are targeting journalists want to make sure the message does not get out. In other words, is there a combination between that and the prevalence of hate speech that's exacerbating the situation?
It's even more complex. Some journalists are targeted because you want to silence truth, and some are targeted because of retaliation, because of propaganda work that they are doing. So it's not that easy. A part of 4 journalists killed in the East and 5 altogether. We had 39 journalists being abducted, and I have talked to some of them who have been released, and we had severe cases of harassment, including some sexual harassment. We had many more journalists whose equipment has been confiscated or destroyed, and I personally talked to some journalists who were severely beaten. I visited some of them in the detention places, and certainly there is a tendency that journalists are among specifically targeted groups. In various contexts, various groups of journalists.
And then the last question is, you mentioned the election of Mr. Poroshenko earlier this month. Has that made a difference? That happened after you had made your first trip there. Do you get a different and more responsive answer now from the Ukrainian authorities than you did before there was an elected president?
I would say that we receive more information on the political initiatives to overcome the crisis. And some of those initiatives are internal political initiatives, but there is also more international discussion, including direct dialogue between presidents of Ukraine and Russian Federation. What is something that is in focus right now is the announcement of President Poroshenko of unilateral ceasefire. If this ceasefire would hold, that would be a very important step.
I'd love to go to the floor now. If you'd raise your hand, I'll call on you. And by the way, we are webcasting this, so when you get the microphone, please hold it very close and hold it steady. And please identify yourself. And I'll take about 3 at once so that we can answer them all together. Start here on the right, and then you'll be second, and then you'll be third. Please.
Hi there, it's James Reinl with
Could I ask you to stand up? It'll be easier for us to hear you otherwise.
Hi there, yeah, James Reinl with Rio Novosti. In your opening remarks, thank you for the briefing, by the way. In your remarks, you mentioned an increase in reports of excessive use of force by the Ukrainian forces on civilians. Could you give us a bit more details about this and suggest whether or not how serious they are, whether or not they amount to some kind of atrocity, and include whether this includes the use of white phosphorus or incendiary bombs, as has been alleged, and maybe suggest what message you think this sends to Poroshenko about how he prosecutes the campaign.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Joelle Metcalf. I'm with the Asahi Shimbun.
Could I ask you to stand? Thank you.
I'm with the Asahi Shimbun, a Japanese newspaper. You mentioned the situation of legal limbo in Crimea, but did the monitoring mission elaborate on the status of judicial systems in eastern Ukraine? Are they capable of carrying out accountability? And does an assessment of eastern Ukraine's judicial system strike you as an essential priority, or should certain steps be taken before looking at it?
And then the third was...
Benny Vidiono. No, you mentioned that you have contact with both sides, and that's why you have good possibility of success. My question is, who are your dialogue partners in the East? Obviously, the UN does not recognize the People's Republic of Donetsk. And these dialogue partners, are they representing the East? And related to that, have you been obstructed in the East in your missions?
All right, Ivan, if you could take those 3 questions.
Of course. Let me first start with the use of force during security operations and effects on civilians. These operations are, of course, making monitoring very dangerous for our people. So we can't be on the spot where, as you have mentioned, for example, bombing is taking place. However, there were some serious allegations that there was a use of force in some instances which did not include sufficient safeguards to protect civilians. So we did not have any allegations of deliberate targeting of civilians, but not sufficient measures taken to preserve well-being of civilians. However, again, these are still allegations and investigations are ongoing, and I cannot, at least yet, be affirmative whether these events have taken place or not. Concerning which type of weapon has been used in certain incident, our people are not military monitors. They're human rights monitors, and they do not have the required military expertise. So perhaps OSCE monitors would be better placed for such qualification and information. Concerning legal situation in the East, there is lawlessness and breakup of the legal system in the East. It does not only imply that we have an armed group who are involved in human rights violations, but common criminals are using such a situation. I met people whose vehicles have been taken or who have been just mugged in the street. So there is high level of insecurity. I, for example, have talked to local prosecutors, and they are saying, well, we can just collect information for some future time, because at the time we do not have police that could be delivering their duties in the field. So there is a legal vacuum, I would agree with you. Who are we talking in the East? We talk to armed groups as well. Of course, we primarily talk to civilians, no matter who they represent, civil society groups, which may be pro-Ukrainian, may be pro-Russian. We also talk to victims and their families. But in attempt to be able to help, for example, with humanitarian releases, and I still remember a case of incarcerated a lady who had a cancer and who was not receiving treatment, we also do talk to leaders of the armed groups. And for example, while being there, I did discuss the issue of releases with Denis Pushilin, who is one of the leaders of so-called Donetsk People's Republic. However, I talked to him as Denis Pushilin, not in the capacity of title of an entity that the United Nations do not recognize.
Very good. We'll take 3 more. I know Evelyn here, and then Edie second, and then this gentleman third.
Thanks, Warren.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, can you...
Evelyn, identify yourself, please.
What'd you say? Oh,
Identify
I'm sorry.
yourself, please.
Evelyn Leopold, journalist at the United Nations, contributor to Huffington Post. I do think in the ceasefire, Russia has enough control over the armed groups in the East, because it seems that sometimes these things take on a life of their own. And secondly, in your crystal ball, I don't see Russia invading because Ukraine's a bit of an economic basket case right now. But can you see the decentralization of Russia dominating the East legally without having to go into it?
Okay. Then Edie Letter in the back.
Thank you, Edith Lederer from the Associated Press. The Russian Foreign Ministry put out a statement after the release of the report today, calling it one-sided for focusing on the situation of armed groups in the East. I wonder if you could comment on the balance in the report.
And the third.
Juanjo Gonzalez with the U.S. mission to the UN. Do we have a clear understanding of who exactly is responsible for the abuses against the journalists?
Concerning ceasefire, this is a real challenge because, to the best of our knowledge, in eastern Ukraine we can speak of at least 3 distinct groups, armed groups, which have separate leadership, not fully coordinating, and this may represent a problem, because some of them may be adhering to ceasefire, some not. How will that reflect? However, I still think it's worthwhile to try with this ceasefire, because it is also true that President Poroshenko will not be new president and a new chance and window of opportunity forever. So I do think it's a timely initiative, and let's hope that ceasefire may hold. Again, it is envisaged that it would be one-sided ceasefire on behalf of government, expecting the other side to support ceasefire. So it's not something that has been directly negotiated between the government and those 3 groups. So that applies to issue of control of these groups. I do not have feeling that all those groups are centrally controlled and that there is a perfect coordination between them. I firmly believe that there is no solution for eastern Ukraine without having a solution for Ukraine as a whole. And in this respect, I was always hoping, and this goes beyond or is a little bit out of my human rights mandate, that there are ways for Ukraine to become a good bridge between European Union and Russian Federation. About comments of our report of being one-sided, a senior colleague, a United Nations colleague, who is from Russian Federation, who recently visited Moscow, told me a story that in subway there were 2 elderly ladies quarreling about one of my appearances at Russian TV. One of them saying, "Why is this guy hating us?" And the other one saying, "Oh no, he's very impartial." So there are different views. What I'm always emphasizing, we were never meant to be neutral as the organization that deals with human rights. We are always siding with victims. So we are not neutral. We have our side. We are against perpetrators of human rights violations, and we are siding with victims. However, we are impartial, which means that we always treat all victims and all perpetrators the same, no matter of their ethnicity or their political affiliation. We try to do the same in Ukraine. Concerning killing of journalists, last killing has taken place near Slovyansk, and they were the cause of death seems to be the mortar shells. And it happened during the conflict and confrontation, and it will require some further investigation to be positive what was not only the cause of death, but to activities of which side that death can be attributed.
One here, two there. Do I see a third hand? A third in the back. Excellent.
Yes, Rhonda Haubin, and I'm a blog columnist at taz.de, which is the Die Tageszeitung website. And listening to your report, somehow I had the impression that basically you have your contacts in the government and somehow difficulty having contacts among the people who are being attacked by the government. And I'm wondering if that's a source of a lack of impartiality, and if that's true, because there's a lot of material that I've seen of all kinds of reports of that there's essentially an attack on a region of the country, but that's not what I heard about during your report. So I'm wondering, is there some problem in who you have access to and who you're somehow seem in this situation to be valuing whatever is happening with the government, and we're not hearing. There have been some real atrocities, but we don't hear about them. Instead, we're hearing about a peace effort, but that would be very good, but that's not anything happening at the moment. So, or we don't see any activity about that. So I'm just wondering if there's some way, there's something happening that you could, that could change how we have a more balanced report. Thank you.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Tatiana Dwyer from United Methodist Women from civil society. And my question is, you mentioned that Ukraine's situation can be a bridge between Russian Federation and European Union. And my question is, given the similar situation in Georgia in 2008, what lessons can be learned for international community can be applied now in the situation for Ukraine to make it really a bridge? Thank you.
And the third was in the back.
Thank you. My name is Sonia Themaya, and I work with UN Women. I have a two-part question. One is, I'm interested to hear whether you think this report and the previous two reports sort of adequately capture the violations of women's rights specifically. And the second part of the question relates to whether you think women have been adequately represented and have enough influence in the peace building and reconciliation processes that have taken place since the national dialogues that you mentioned. For example, women were virtually invisible in those dialogues. Thank you.
Okay, well.
Concerning communication to government and non-governmental actors, our strong side is always communication to non-governmental sector. We do communicate to government, but we always try to talk to population as much as we can. There may be a problem that in some areas we simply, because of ongoing fighting, we have problems with access. For example, there were some allegations of difficult situation in Slovyansk, and if I will be in a position to go back to Ukraine, that's certainly a place of my utmost interest. We do report on information that we can verify. So it's certainly easier to verify information in areas where active fighting is of lower intensity. The higher intensity of fighting, the more difficult is to gather and verify information. On Georgia and parallels with Ukraine, I have to stay within the framework of my human rights mandate. And what is definitely lessons learned, that any sort of divisions of a country negatively reflect, and that population at the end pays the price. And quite often, if division is an interethnic division, it's usually both ethnicities that are worse off than before divisions. Now, something on the issue of women. What was worthwhile mentioning is that in peaceful period of protests in Ukraine, women had an important part. They were participating as peaceful protesters as a part of Maidan. Now, at the moment, in the eastern parts of the country, we do have some information that there were some cases of women who were harassed during period of abduction or illegal detention, and in this way were disproportionately affected. Concerning other aspects, in most of challenges of humanitarian nature, they're simply sharing the challenges that are faced by all genders.
Yeah. Matthew Lee in the back. Anybody else? We've got time. Okay, Matthew, ask your question and we'll take it.
Matthew Lee, Inner City Press. I'd wanted to ask you about this June 2 incident in Luhansk, where the administrative building was exploded and some 7 people killed. I was looking at your report, and it seems like, I mean, there's been a lot of discussion of it at the UN and the noon briefing in front of the Security Council, and it seems like, I was surprised. If I'm not wrong, there's like, you have one paragraph on it, and you just say, on the one hand, some say man-pad, some say from a jet, and the OSCE seems to have said that it came from the air, and I think there was a lot of expectation that your report would kind of resolve this question, or at least take it forward. Could you say, what exactly did you do to investigate this explosion of the building and strafing along toward it, and is there more coming out, or is this the full extent of your inquiry? Thanks a lot.
Anybody else? Ivan?
Well, I think that report is clear that there is still investigation on this one going on. It certainly does not make investigation easier that human rights monitors are not experts in explosive devices, so it requires some more time to check the causes of the use of certain weapons. On this issue, as well as some other issues that remain unanswered, I do expect that with the passage of time, we will have more definite answers. It, of course, would be better to have it sooner than later. However, it is important that there are no major contested issues that remain unanswered.
Ivan, let me just ask one last question. You said a moment ago, if I go back to Ukraine, don't you think it's inevitable you will be going back, unless you're discouraged by people there from going? You've gone once every month for 3 months. There have been 3 reports. Won't there be probably a 4th report and a 4th visit to Ukraine? And in connection with that question, in the report, you discussed the fact that on your subsequent trips, you were able to discuss with people the preceding report. Is it possible to characterize what the response has been by people on the ground to past reports by UNHCR. And what I'm trying to get at is, can the UN really affect this situation? Is it having a positive effect?
Now, let me start with the facts. Does it have the effect that we would like it to have? No. Does it influence? It does. So it's a mixed bag. With some of our recommendations, we have, I believe, been successful. However, some of them have not been followed. And the issue that you are raising is probably the major issues of one of our following reports, and it's the analysis of the implementation of recommendations. And this probably will also be an opportunity after such an analysis to discuss with authorities on the way how to improve that more of suggested measures are being implemented.
Very good. Well, if there are no more questions, I think we'll bring it to a close. Ivan Šimonović, thank you for your work that you're doing, which cannot be easy, and for providing a window for all of us on that very difficult situation. And if I can just say, I think on behalf of other people in the room, best of luck to you.
Thank you.